Some promises are so strong that even blindness cannot break them. The dog was blind. Everyone in Harbor Point knew that. His cloudy eyes never followed the gulls wheeling above the Atlantic. They never tracked the fishing boats drifting beyond the breakers. They never turned toward the children who sometimes stopped to stare. Yet every morning, before the sun climbed over the horizon, the old German shepherd was there beside the same battered suitcase, lying on a stretch of gray sand near the edge of the sea. The suitcase looked as forgotten as the dog. Its leather had cracked beneath years of salt and wind. Rust stained the brass latches. The handle hung by a single strip of worn fabric. It seemed like the kind of thing that should have been carried away by a storm long ago. But somehow it remained. Just like him. The people in town talked about the pair constantly. Fishermen mentioned them over black coffee before dawn. Shop owners pointed them out to tourists. Children invented stories. Some believed the suitcase held treasure. Others thought it belonged to a sailor lost at sea. Nobody knew the truth. The strangest part was what happened whenever someone tried to move it. The dog always found it again. A teenager once dragged the suitcase nearly half a mile down the shoreline as a prank. By sunrise the next morning, the German shepherd was lying beside it once more, as calm as if nothing had happened. Another time, two men carried it all the way to a storage shed near the marina. The dog disappeared for an entire day. Then, just after sunset, townspeople spotted him sitting outside the shed door, nose pressed against the weathered wood. Somehow he had found it. Every single time. The sea breeze drifted across the beach carrying the scent of salt, seaweed, and distant rain. Waves rolled onto the shore in slow rhythm, spreading white foam across the sand before retreating again. The dog never reacted to the noise. He simply rested beside the suitcase, ears twitching occasionally as if listening to something far beyond the crashing water. On a cool October morning, Ethan Walker noticed him for the first time. Ethan was 38 years old, a former Marine, who had returned to Harbor Point after spending most of his adult life moving from one assignment to another. The town felt smaller than he remembered, quieter. Some days he walked the shoreline simply to clear his head. That morning the fog hung low over the beach. The air carried a chill sharp enough to sting the lungs. Ethan spotted the shape through the mist long before he reached it. At first he assumed someone had abandoned an old suitcase near the water. Then he saw the dog. The shepherd lifted his head slightly as Ethan approached. His muzzle had turned silver with age. Scars marked one ear. His ribs showed faintly beneath his sable coat. But it was the eyes that stopped Ethan cold. They were pale and empty, completely blind. The dog should have seemed helpless. Instead, he looked like a sentry standing watch over something important. Ethan crouched several feet away. The shepherd remained still. The wind stirred the fur along his neck. Behind them, the ocean stretched endlessly beneath the rising sun. "What are you guarding, buddy?" Ethan asked quietly. The dog did not move. He simply turned his blind face toward the sea. And for the first time, Ethan felt the strange sensation that the old shepherd was not waiting for someone. He was protecting something. Something nobody else could see. The next morning, Ethan returned before sunrise. He told himself he was only taking another walk along the shoreline. But deep down he knew that was not the reason. Something about the old shepherd lingered in his thoughts long after he had left the beach. Maybe it was the blindness. Maybe it was the suitcase. Or maybe it was the quiet certainty in the dog's posture, as though he understood something the rest of the world had forgotten. A thin layer of fog drifted above the water when Ethan arrived. The lighthouse at the edge of Harbor Point appeared and disappeared behind curtains of mist. Waves rolled gently onto the shore, carrying bits of driftwood and sea grass before pulling them back into the Atlantic. The beach was empty except for the dog. He was exactly where Ethan had left him, beside the suitcase, facing the sea, as if he had not moved an inch all night. Ethan stopped several yards away and studied him. The shepherd's fur was damp from the ocean air. Tiny grains of sand clung to his paws. Yet despite his age, there was still dignity in the way he carried himself. Not weakness, not defeat, duty. Ethan walked toward the nearby bait shop that opened before dawn. 20 minutes later, he returned carrying a bottle of water and a paper container filled with pieces of roasted chicken. The scent immediately drifted across the beach. The dog's ears twitched. Slowly, he turned his head toward Ethan. For the first time, the former Marine noticed how extraordinary the animal's hearing had become. Every movement of the waves, every cry of a gull, every footstep across the sand. The dog seemed to map the world through sound alone. Ethan placed the food a few feet away and stepped back. The shepherd sniffed the air carefully. He rose to his feet, moving with deliberate caution. For a moment, Ethan thought he might finally leave the suitcase. Instead, the dog took only enough steps to reach the food while keeping one paw pressed against the old leather case. Ethan could not help smiling. Still guarding it, "Huh," he murmured. The dog finished eating and returned immediately to his position beside the suitcase. The movement was so automatic it felt rehearsed, like a soldier returning to his post. Throughout the morning, a few locals passed by. An elderly fisherman named Walter stopped and shook his head. "That dog has been doing this for months," he said. "Nobody knows where he came from." Ethan glanced toward the shepherd. "Nobody ever checked for an owner?" Walter laughed softly. "Everyone tried. No collar, no microchip, no missing reports. It is like he appeared out of nowhere." The old fisherman lowered his voice. "Some folks think he belongs to the sea." Ethan smirked at the comment, but later, after Walter left, the words stayed with him. Around noon, clouds gathered offshore. The sky darkened slightly. A stronger wind swept across the beach. The suitcase shifted a few inches in the sand. Immediately, the shepherd stood up. Every muscle in his body became tense. His ears pointed forward. His nose lifted into the wind. Then, something unusual happened. The dog released a low whine. It was not fear. It was anticipation. Ethan felt it instantly. The shepherd was listening for something, waiting for something, far beyond the crashing waves, far beyond the reach of sight. And then, for the first time since Ethan had met him, the old dog slowly turned away from the ocean and faced inland, toward the town, as though sensing that something was finally about to change. That evening, Harbor Point settled beneath a blanket of low gray clouds. The cheerful colors of the waterfront faded into muted shades of silver and blue as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. Fishing boats returned to their docks. Shop owners locked their doors. Porch lights flickered on one by one along the narrow streets overlooking the sea. Yet Ethan could not stop thinking about what he had seen. The image of the old shepherd turning away from the ocean lingered in his mind. It had not felt random. It had felt deliberate. As darkness settled over town, he found himself walking back toward the beach carrying a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. The wind had strengthened. Waves crashed harder against the shoreline, sending sprays of salt into the air. The scent of rain drifted across the water. When Ethan reached the familiar stretch of sand, he immediately noticed something unusual. The dog was standing, not resting beside the suitcase as he always did. Standing completely still, listening. Ethan slowed his pace. The shepherd's ears were raised high. His nose twitched constantly as though sorting through countless scents carried by the wind. Then the dog took 3 cautious steps away from the suitcase. Ethan froze. It was the first time he had seen him willingly create distance from it. The shepherd paused, turned slightly, then took several more steps. Slowly, purposefully, his blind eyes stared into darkness, yet somehow he moved with confidence. Ethan followed at a distance. The dog crossed a narrow section of beach where old driftwood had gathered after recent tides. He navigated around every obstacle with surprising precision. The sound of waves echoed through the night while the beam of Ethan's flashlight swept across wet sand and scattered shells. After nearly 100 yards, the shepherd stopped beside a weathered wooden post sticking out of the ground. It looked like the remains of an old dock long swallowed by time and storms. The dog lowered his nose toward the base of the post. He sniffed carefully. Then he released a soft whine. Ethan approached. "What is it?" he asked quietly. The shepherd pawed gently at the sand. Once, then again. Ethan knelt and examined the area. There was nothing unusual, just damp sand, fragments of shell, and sea grass tangled around the old wood. Yet the dog's behavior changed completely. His tail remained still. His breathing became faster. He pawed the same spot again. Ethan stared at him. The old Marine had spent years trusting instincts in situations that could not always be explained. Sometimes details mattered. Sometimes patterns mattered. And sometimes an animal sensed something people missed entirely. The wind suddenly shifted direction. A distant roll of thunder echoed over the Atlantic. The first drops of rain began falling. Ethan glanced toward the suitcase far down the shoreline. The shepherd turned his head toward it as well. For several long seconds, he remained motionless. Then, As though satisfied he had marked the location, he slowly walked back. Ethan followed in silence. The dog returned directly to the suitcase and settled beside it once more. Rain tapped softly against the old leather case. The lighthouse beam rotated across the dark water in steady intervals. Everything seemed normal again. Yet Ethan knew something had changed. Before leaving, he swept his flashlight across the side of the suitcase. A faint marking caught his attention. Nearly hidden beneath layers of salt and age were two faded letters burned into the leather. He crouched lower for a better look. J.W. Ethan's heartbeat slowed. His own last name was Walker, and for reasons he could not explain, a chill moved through him that had nothing to do with the cold Atlantic wind. Ethan barely slept that night. Rain tapped against the windows of his small cottage overlooking the harbor, while the wind rattled the porch railing outside. The faded initials on the suitcase replayed in his mind again and again. J.W. Two simple letters. Nothing more. Yet they stirred memories he had not visited in years. His father had been James Walker. Ethan had been only 13 when the Coast Guard ended its search. Official reports called it an accident at sea. A small private vessel caught in a sudden storm. No survivors found. No remains recovered. Just an empty horizon and a family left with unanswered questions. By dawn the rain had stopped. Pale sunlight filtered through drifting clouds, turning the ocean silver. Ethan drove to the Harbor Point Historical Society, a small brick building near Main Street that held decades of local records. Inside, the scent of old paper and polished wood filled the quiet rooms. Behind the front desk sat Margaret Lewis, a retired schoolteacher who seemed to know every story the town had ever produced. She adjusted her glasses when Ethan entered. "You are out early," she said with a smile. Ethan returned the smile, but got straight to the point. "Do you remember anything about James Walker?" Margaret's expression softened immediately. "Your father?" Ethan nodded. The older woman looked toward a wall of filing cabinets. "Some stories never really leave this town." 20 minutes later, she placed a worn newspaper archive on a table. Ethan carefully turned brittle pages. Headlines spoke of fishing tournaments, summer festivals, and storms long forgotten. Then he found it. August, 25 years earlier. Local man missing at sea. Beneath the article was a photograph of his father standing beside a weathered boat. Ethan stared silently. The years disappeared for a moment. James Walker looked exactly as he remembered. Strong shoulders. Easy smile. Windblown hair. A man who always smelled faintly of salt water and cedar. As Ethan continued reading, a smaller detail caught his eye. The article mentioned a leather travel case that James always carried aboard his boat. Friends described it as unusually important to him. It supposedly contained personal keepsakes he never traveled without. Ethan sat back slowly. A strange feeling settled in his chest. The suitcase on the beach. The initials. The dog guarding it. None of it made sense. Yet the pieces were beginning to move toward each other. That afternoon, he returned to the shoreline. The shepherd was waiting exactly where he expected. The old dog lifted his head as Ethan approached. This time, Ethan sat beside him rather than several feet away. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and drying sea grass. Seagulls drifted overhead. Neither man nor dog moved for several minutes. Finally, Ethan rested a hand gently on the suitcase. The shepherd remained calm. No growl. No warning. No sign of concern. It was the first time he had allowed anyone to touch it. Ethan looked down at the blind dog. "You know something, do not you?" he whispered. The shepherd's ears twitched. Then he leaned slightly closer, resting his muzzle against Ethan's knee. The simple gesture caught him off guard. Trust. Not complete trust, but the beginning of it. Far out beyond the harbor, dark clouds gathered again along the horizon. The lighthouse beam flashed steadily across the afternoon haze. Ethan followed the shepherd's gaze toward the distant water. And for the first time, he realized the dog was no longer watching the sea alone. Somehow, in a way he could not explain, the old shepherd had chosen him to watch with him. The storm arrived 2 nights later. Harbor Point had seen hundreds of storms over the years, but this one carried a different weight. The sky darkened long before sunset. Thick clouds swallowed the horizon. The air smelled of rain, salt, and distant lightning. Shop owners secured awnings. Fishing crews hurried their boats into protected slips. By evening, the first heavy winds swept through town, rattling windows and bending the tops of the pines along the coast. Ethan stood on the porch of his cottage watching the weather move across the Atlantic. He should have stayed inside. Any reasonable person would have. Yet his thoughts remained fixed on the beach, fixed on the old shepherd, fixed on the suitcase. As darkness settled over the shoreline, he finally grabbed a rain jacket and headed toward the water. The wind hit him immediately. Sand skittered across the ground in sharp bursts. Waves crashed against the shore with enough force to shake the air. The lighthouse beam struggled to cut through sheets of rain. When Ethan reached the familiar stretch of beach, his heart tightened. The shepherd was still there, curled beside the suitcase despite the storm. Rain soaked his sable coat. Water streamed from his muzzle. Yet he refused to move. Ethan hurried closer. "Come on, buddy," he called above the wind. "You cannot stay out here tonight." The dog lifted his head. For a moment, Ethan thought he might finally agree. Instead, the shepherd rose to his feet and turned toward the ocean. His ears stood rigid. Every muscle in his body became tense. Then something extraordinary happened. The dog released a sharp bark. The first bark Ethan had ever heard from him. It cut through the storm like a signal. Before Ethan could react, the shepherd began moving away from the suitcase. Fast. Faster than Ethan had thought possible for a dog his age. He headed down the shoreline through rain and darkness. Ethan followed immediately. The beach stretched ahead in flashes of lightning and shadow. Wind roared across the dunes. The shepherd never hesitated. He moved as though guided by something invisible. 100 yards. Then 200. Ethan struggled to keep pace. Finally, the dog reached the weathered dock post he had discovered days earlier. The same place where he had pawed at the sand. The shepherd stopped. Then he began digging. Rain hammered the beach around them. Sand flew beneath his paws. Again and again he dug at the same location. Ethan dropped to one knee beside him. At first he saw nothing. Then his hand struck something solid beneath the wet sand. Wood. His pulse quickened. Together, man and dog uncovered the corner of a small object buried below the surface. Ethan cleared away more sand. A narrow wooden box slowly emerged from the ground. It was old. Extremely old. The wood had darkened with age and seawater. Metal hinges lined one side. The shepherd immediately stopped digging. He stood quietly beside Ethan, breathing hard. Waiting. Ethan stared at the box. Rain drummed against the lid. His fingers hesitated above the rusted clasp. Every instinct told him that whatever lay inside was connected to the mystery that had brought the dog here. Connected to the suitcase. Connected to the initials. Connected perhaps to a story that had waited 25 years beneath the sand. A flash of lightning illuminated the beach. In that brief white light, Ethan noticed something carved into the top of the box. His breath caught. The same two initials. J.W. The shepherd stepped closer and gently pressed his muzzle against Ethan's arm, as if telling him the search was finally over. And the truth was about to begin. The storm eased shortly before midnight. Rain still fell in steady sheets, but the violent gusts had begun to weaken. Ethan carried the wooden box beneath the shelter of an abandoned lifeguard station overlooking the beach. The shepherd followed closely behind, staying near enough that Ethan could hear the soft rhythm of his breathing beneath the sound of the rain. Water dripped from the dog's coat. His blind eyes remained fixed in Ethan's direction, as though he knew exactly where the box rested. For several moments, Ethan simply stared at it. 25 years of questions sat beneath his hands. 25 years of wondering what had happened to his father beyond the reach of the horizon. Finally, he brushed away the sand packed around the rusted clasp. The metal resisted at first. Then, with a soft crack, it gave way. Ethan slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of carefully preserved items wrapped in oilcloth. Time had touched them, but somehow they had survived. His hands trembled as he unfolded the first bundle. A set of military dog tags rested inside. The metal was worn, but recognizable. Ethan turned them over. The engraving was faint, yet unmistakable. James Walker. His throat tightened. Beneath the tags lay several photographs protected inside a weathered plastic sleeve. Ethan pulled them free. One showed a younger version of his father standing beside a small fishing boat at sunset. Another showed a smiling woman holding a boy no older than 6. Ethan stared at the image. It was him. The photograph carried him backward through time. Summer afternoons. Salt air. His father's laughter. Long walks along the harbor. Memories he thought had faded forever returned with startling clarity. The shepherd quietly settled beside him while Ethan continued searching through the box. Beneath the photographs rested a folded letter sealed inside a waterproof envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in familiar handwriting, were simple words. For Ethan. His breath caught. For a long moment, he could not move. The rain tapped against the wooden walls around them. Somewhere beyond the darkness, waves continued their endless conversation with the shore. Finally, he opened the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Steady, patient, familiar. James had written it shortly before his final voyage. The letter spoke not of fear, but of hope. He wrote about the ocean he loved, about mistakes he had made, about lessons he hoped his son would carry into adulthood. Most of all, he wrote about promises. One passage caused Ethan to stop reading altogether. If you ever find this letter, it means someone faithful brought it home. Trust them. Some things find their way back when the time is right. Ethan lowered the paper slowly. The shepherd had shifted closer. His muzzle now rested gently against Ethan's boot. The old dog's ears twitched as if listening for something only he could hear. Ethan reached down and ran a hand through the wet fur along his neck. Was it you? He whispered. Were you the one who brought this back? The shepherd gave no answer. Yet a strange peace settled over the moment. Ethan looked back into the box. At the very bottom rested one final item. A small brass key attached to a leather tag darkened by age. 3 words had been carefully stamped into the leather. Open the suitcase. Ethan stared at the key while thunder rumbled faintly over the distant Atlantic. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break. For the first time in 25 years, the mystery surrounding his father was no longer growing smaller. It was becoming larger. And somehow, the old shepherd had known exactly where the journey needed to begin. The first light of dawn spread across Harbor Point in shades of pale gold and silver. The storm had passed. Calm water stretched toward the horizon as though the Atlantic itself had finally exhaled. Ethan stood beside the weathered suitcase on the beach, the brass key resting in his palm. The shepherd sat quietly nearby. For the first time since Ethan had met him, the old dog seemed relaxed. Not finished, but closer, as though some invisible burden had become lighter during the night. Ethan studied the rusted lock. Years of salt and wind had worn it nearly smooth. He inserted the key carefully. For a moment nothing happened. Then the mechanism turned with a soft click. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the morning silence. Ethan slowly opened the case. Inside, he found no treasure, no stacks of money, no shocking secret hidden for decades. Instead, he found something far more valuable. The interior contained a collection of carefully arranged keepsakes. A faded compass, a folded Marine Corps flag, several letters tied together with blue ribbon, a small notebook, and resting on top of everything else was a photograph. Ethan picked it up first. His breath caught immediately. The image showed his father standing beside a German shepherd. The dog looked young and powerful, with alert ears and intelligent eyes. James had one arm draped around the animal's shoulders. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, was a single name. Sailor. Ethan looked down at the blind shepherd sitting nearby. The resemblance was unmistakable. Different age, different generation, yet the same proud muzzle, the same sable coloring, the same noble posture. His pulse quickened as he opened the notebook. The pages contained entries written over many years. Notes about weather, fishing routes, family memories. Then the entries changed. Ethan found himself reading about a storm nearly 3 decades earlier. James described discovering an injured German shepherd stranded on a rocky section of coastline after severe weather. The dog had survived alone for days before being rescued. James named him Sailor. According to the journal, the two became inseparable. The entries spoke of loyalty, trust, and countless journeys along the coast. Ethan turned another page. Then another. One passage stopped him. Completely. Sailor had eventually fathered a litter of puppies before growing old. James carefully recorded where each puppy had gone. One remained with a local fishing family. Another was adopted by a lighthouse keeper. The bloodline continued through generations around Harbor Point. Ethan slowly lowered the notebook. His eyes moved toward the old shepherd. Suddenly the impossible seemed less impossible. The dog had not appeared from nowhere. He belonged here. His family belonged here. For decades, generation after generation, descendants of Sailor had lived along this coastline. Ethan continued reading. The final entries were written shortly before his father's disappearance. James described placing the keepsakes inside the suitcase before an upcoming voyage. He also mentioned something else. If anything ever happened to him, he trusted Sailor to find his way home. Ethan closed the journal. Emotion tightened his throat. The shepherd rose slowly and walked toward him. His movements were careful but certain. He stopped beside Ethan and rested his head gently against his arm. Ethan looked out across the calm ocean. The answer suddenly felt clear. Not magic. Not coincidence. Loyalty passed from one life to another, one generation to the next. Somewhere along the way, a promise had survived. A promise carried through bloodlines, through years, through storms and seasons. And now, sitting beside him beneath the morning sun, was the final guardian of that promise. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm Harbor Point had not felt in years. Word spread quickly about the suitcase, the journal, and the remarkable blind shepherd who had guarded them through sun, rain, and storm. Yet Ethan shared only what mattered. He never spoke of miracles. He never claimed to understand everything. Some things felt too sacred to explain. Every morning he returned to the beach carrying coffee in a metal thermos and a folding chair. The old shepherd was always waiting nearby. Sometimes he slept beside the suitcase. Sometimes he sat facing the ocean as though listening to something hidden beneath the sound of the waves. Ethan spent hours reading the letters his father had left behind. Each page revealed pieces of a man he had barely known. There were stories about Marine Corps service, stories about friendship and sacrifice, stories about Harbor Point itself. But the passages Ethan returned to most often were the ones about family. James wrote about missing birthdays, missing school plays, missing ordinary moments that fathers were supposed to witness. The words carried regret, but never self-pity. One line remained with Ethan long after he closed the final letter. If duty ever takes me too far away, I hope love finds a way to bring me home. One afternoon, Ethan visited the small fishing family mentioned in the journal. The elderly woman who answered the door listened carefully as he explained what he had discovered. Tears filled her eyes before he even finished speaking. She disappeared inside and returned carrying a framed photograph. It showed her grandfather standing beside a German shepherd nearly 70 years earlier. Sailor. Another link in the chain. Another piece of a promise stretching across generations. Over the next week, Ethan uncovered more stories. The lighthouse keeper's family still preserved photographs of one of Sailor's descendants. A retired harbor worker remembered seeing German shepherds patrolling the shoreline throughout his childhood. The bloodline had never truly vanished. It had simply remained hidden in plain sight, woven into the town's history like salt in the sea air. Through it all, the old shepherd stayed close to Ethan. The dog rarely barked, rarely demanded attention, yet his presence seemed to fill every empty space. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Atlantic, Ethan noticed something unusual. The shepherd had wandered away from the suitcase. Not far, only 30 feet, but it was the first time he had willingly left it unattended. Ethan watched quietly. The dog stood facing the harbor, his ears lifted slightly despite his blindness. A gentle breeze moved through his fur. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he returned to Ethan instead of the suitcase. He lowered himself onto the sand beside the former Marine and rested his head against Ethan's boot. Ethan looked down at him. Something had changed. For months, perhaps years, the dog had guarded a mission, a responsibility passed down through blood, memory, and instinct. Now the responsibility seemed different. The suitcase remained where it was. The journal remained safe. The letters had reached their destination. And for the first time since Ethan had met him, the old shepherd appeared completely at peace. As darkness settled over Harbor Point, Ethan reached down and gently scratched behind the dog's ears. The shepherd closed his eyes. Beyond them, the lighthouse beams swept across the water, back and forth, steady as a heartbeat, steady as faith. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan felt the strange certainty that the final chapter of this story was drawing near. The following morning arrives wrapped in a blanket of gray mist drifting in from the Atlantic. Harbor Point feels quieter than usual. The gulls cry less. The fishing boats move more slowly across the harbor. Even the waves seem gentler as they roll against the shore. Ethan notices it immediately. The old shepherd does not rise to greet him. For months the dog has always sensed his arrival. A slight turn of the head, a twitch of the ears, a slow wag of the tail. Today he remains resting on the sand beside the suitcase. Calm, peaceful, still alert, but tired in a way Ethan has not seen before. Ethan kneels beside him and places a hand against his shoulder. The shepherd responds with a soft movement of his tail. Nothing more. The warm scent of salt and sea grass drifts through the cool morning air. For a long time, neither of them moves. Ethan simply sits beside the dog and watches the ocean. The same ocean that carried away answers for 25 years. The same ocean that somehow returned them. Near noon, several townspeople stop by. Some bring food. Others bring blankets. One elderly fisherman removes his cap and gently scratches the shepherd beneath the chin. Nobody says much. They do not need to. The dog has become part of Harbor Point. A guardian. A witness. A living piece of local history. By late afternoon, the mist begins to clear. Sunlight breaks through the clouds in narrow beams that shimmer across the water. Ethan notices the shepherd slowly lifting his head. The dog turns toward the harbor. His blind eyes stare into a distance only he can see. Then something unexpected happens. He stands. His legs tremble slightly, but he remains upright. Ethan immediately rises beside him. The shepherd begins walking. Not toward the suitcase. Not toward town. Toward the old dock where the wooden box had been discovered. Ethan follows quietly. The dog moves with surprising certainty despite his blindness. Step by step, he crosses the sand and reaches the weathered pilings. There he stops. The breeze rustles through his fur. The scent of salt hangs heavy in the air. For several moments, he simply stands facing the ocean. Ethan feels a strange tightness in his chest. It is the same feeling he experienced when he first touched the journal. The feeling that something larger than himself is unfolding. Then the shepherd slowly lowers himself onto the ground. Ethan kneels beside him. The dog rests his head against Ethan's arm exactly as he has done many times before. But this time feels different. Not sad. Not frightening. Simply complete. Ethan reaches into his pocket and removes the photograph of James and Sailor. He places it gently on the dock beside them. The afternoon sun illuminates the faded image. Man and dog. Loyalty and trust. A promise made long ago. The shepherd's ears twitch softly as the breeze passes over the photograph. Ethan cannot explain why, but it feels as though the old dog knows it is there. Knows the journey is finally reaching its end. The lighthouse beam begins its evening sweep across the water as shadows lengthen over Harbor Point. Ethan remains beside him through every passing minute. Neither of them speaks. Neither of them needs words. Some bonds are stronger than language. Some promises survive longer than memory. And as the sun slowly sinks toward the horizon, Ethan realizes that the faithful guardian who carried his father's final message home is preparing to leave behind one last gift.